Hello, I am Bart Vanthuyne. This presentation on the early Old Kingdom rock circle cemeteries in Middle Egypt provides a summary of some of the results of my PhD that I did at the KU Leuven for the Dayr al-Barsha project. It was made in late 2020 during the second lockdown of the COVID pandemic for a university program in the UK, and I've now decided to make it available for the general public. The fieldwork was supported by a multidisciplinary team, and I am grateful to everybody listed here. Special thanks also go to the people of Dayr al-Barsha, the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, and the inspectors of the Malawi Inspectorate, without whom all this would not have been possible. Funding was provided by the KU Leuven Bijzonder Onderzoeksfonds and the Flemish Fonds voor Wetenschappelijk Onderzoek. The upcoming presentation will show many photos of human remains, so please be aware of this. Now, let us begin.
Hello, I am Bart Vanthuyne, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Cologne and a research fellow at the KU Leuven. I'm gonna do a presentation on early Old Kingdom rock circle cemeteries in Middle Egypt. When you think of the early Old Kingdom, you think of pyramids, large mastabas, decorated tombs. Today, we're having none of that. I'm going to talk about something else. More specifically, the results of my PhD research on the rock circle cemeteries in the 15th and 16th Upper Egyptian nomes. That's in the area near modern-day Minya. And more specifically, a stretch of land between Dayr al-Barsha and Nuwayrat, which is about 25 kilometers of terrain east of the Nile. For our PhD, we want to have a look at the dating, the size, the density, and the development of these hitherto barely known rock circle cemeteries. So have a look at the composition, size and treatment of the buried population, see if there was any variation in tomb location, tomb types, burial containers and grave goods, and check if we could see or identify any remaining traces of ritual activity. To do that, we used satellite image analyses, geophysical prospection, carried out a number of excavations, did numerous surveys, and we had a team of variety of specialists look at our human remains and other objects and small finds. In the course of our research period from 2009 to 2013, we found 4 large rock circle cemeteries. In Dayr al-Barsha, we found rock circle tombs over a distance of 2.7 kilometers. And approximately over the same stretch of terrain in neighboring Dayr Abu Hinnis. Presumably more rock circle tombs were in this area, but the terrain here had been bulldozed clear of boulders by the time our research began. And presumably more were also here on the escarpment in Nazlat al-Barsha, but this terrain had also already been reclaimed for other purposes. Further to the north, in the 16th Upper Egyptian nome, at Beni Hassan al-Shuruq, which is just south of the Beni Hassan with the well-known decorated Middle Kingdom tombs in this area. So here on the escarpment over a distance of more than 1 kilometer, we found additional rock circle tombs. More recently, I also found more here on the plateau, and I was awarded an ES Centenary Award. So after the corona, hopefully we can continue our survey work here to identify more rock circle tombs on the plateau in this area and up here. So this map is bound to change if we can continue to work here. Slightly further north at Nuwayrat, we found hundreds more rock circle tombs on the escarpment and plateau over a distance of 2.6 kilometers. So all in all, 4 large rock circle cemeteries. But due to time restrictions, I will focus today's presentation on the results from the Dayr al-Barsha rock circle cemetery. In the end, we discovered 186 tombs and nearly 30 more possible tombs, so over 2.7 kilometers. Some of these tombs contained more than one burial. So in the end, we have at least data for at least 231 burials and potential burials. The terrain. These rock circle tombs were built all over the escarpment that you see here, from the beginning all the way until the top left corner. The terrain is covered with stones and boulders of all shapes and sizes. Terrain itself, the gradient increases as you go uphill and decreases slowly as you approach the desert plain. I assume that quite a few of you have no idea what a rock circle tomb is, so I'm going to spend some time of my presentation to go into what a rock circle tomb is and the large variety of burial containers that were used within the burial space. So let us start with tomb S19. When we found it, we saw the edge of a pottery coffin visible on the surface. Here we still have a partial stone cover present. When we cleared it, we saw that the pottery coffin was still in situ, largely well preserved. Inside, we found the remains of the disturbed remains of a 19-year-old woman. The coffin had been placed directly on the hillside, and then stones and boulders were placed around it. Some more stones were placed next to the coffin to wedge it in tightly into position. You see there is hardly any space for any burial goods, and we didn't find any around the coffin, nor was anything left within the disturbed remains of the pottery coffin, mixed within. Another example, here within the red outline we saw the edge of a ceramic container, and when we cleared it we saw that the ancient Egyptians made use of a depression in the landscape here, where they had placed a tightly contracted adult male on a flat surface, and then they placed a large vat over it. Because the body was too large to fit within the circumference of the pot, they had to break it and place a slab over the head and part of the body. But looters moved aside the slab and damaged the head area. So we don't know if any objects were placed in this area, but for the rest here it was all in situ. We didn't find anything, so nor did we find any objects or ceramic vessels on the surface of the tomb. So we see that adults were not only placed under these large vats, but also in them. Here on the left is one of two intact adult burials, probably a female. The skeleton was poorly preserved, but no objects were found in the vat. Here on the right we have an example of one of the few examples of a juvenile buried in one of those large vats. Nothing was found within the burial space or the vat, but on the exterior we did find pieces of Meidum ball. Whether the vessel had been broken at the time of the funeral or the moment it was brought as an offering good to the tomb, we don't know. Of course, there was 4.5 millennia for it to break. You can see here also on the image that the pot was tightly surrounded by the stones, which gives us a clue that this tomb was made at the time of the funeral. And we've seen this in many other cases, that there was clearly no intention for any burial goods to be placed around these burial containers. Otherwise, there would have been, even in the case when the tomb was looted, there would have been open spaces where you would expect objects to have been placed. But this clearly was not the intention when these tombs were made. So, in a number of cases, we do see remains of ceramic vessels on the exterior, and only rarely do we see one placed next to the burial container. Here, two more examples of juvenile burials in decorated jars. The one on the left made use of these two huge boulders which created an overhang where the ancient Egyptians placed one of these decorated pots under them, and then the space was closed off with stone slabs. Now this tomb had been disturbed, so the slabs were partially pulled aside, but within it we still found the remains of a 7-year-old. On the right we have one of the better preserved rock circle tombs. It has a diameter of about 3-4 meters, and within the central space you have here a burial space in which we found the disturbed remains of a 3.5-year-old, pieces of the decorated jar, and also 2 beads. But you see that for these juveniles clearly an effort was made. Now these tombs are high up the hills escarpment, that clearly an effort was made to make large superstructures even for these young children. No objects or just a few beads were placed with them, but the focus was on the large superstructure. Here another example. Near the base of the hillside, again burial in a decorated jar, which we found here within the red outline. When you look at the section, we only found the lower half of the vessel. Here we have many pieces to see what it was like. This pot contained either a juvenile and a fetus, or at least one of them, and the other was buried next to it. Due to the disturbance, we cannot determine this anymore. But we found in several other cases the remains of juveniles and fetuses buried together. So it seems to be an indication that they were related and that parents brought their children, 2 separate cases, to this small, well, that they buried them together at least. When you look at the section, you see that the upper half of the vessel would have been exposed at the current day surface. So we are missing part of the superstructure, or at least of the tomb covering nowadays. So either more boulders were used to cover the vessel than there are present today, or they just covered it with sands and smaller stones which had eroded away over time. We don't know whether these boulders were reused already in the early Old Kingdom for other tomb superstructures, but we do have some indication that at least in the Middle Kingdom boulders were used in superstructures of Middle Kingdom tombs, and in the New Kingdom and later periods boulders were also used in quarry causeways. So this could be an indication, or when some of the superstructure of the early Old Kingdom tombs was dismantled. Another example of where we found a lot of pottery on the surface, some of it sticking out of the modern surface level. And when we cleared the red outline, we found the remains of a 17-year-old in squat position or seated position, and over which a basin had been placed. So this person was buried under a ceramic pot. But no objects were found within the burial space or around the tomb. Another example here, this is a burial of a 2 to 3 year old in a basin. The pot had been placed next to some stones on the edge of a water runoff channel, so this is clearly not the same as having your child buried within one of those large stone superstructures that we had seen earlier. So the parents spent less effort on visibility, but nevertheless the pot itself contained the third largest concentration of beads that we found in any of the rock circle tombs in Dayr al-Barsha. So less focus was spent on the tomb outline, but more on the burial goods within the child. Here, another example of a tomb near the desert plain. Normally, if the boulders weren't there, you would walk straight by it. When we cleared the surface just below it, out came the a small vat, or a medium-sized vat with a spout, which contained the remains of a fetus burial. It had been disturbed, but there was still enough in there to see that a fetus was buried in it. No burial goods, but here you can see just how small an area is needed for one of these tombs. Another example, here we have some stones and boulders covering an area of about 1.5 meters in diameter. Within the red outline we saw some shirts sticking out of the surface, and so we examined it, and we found the remains of a 6 to 7 year old buried in a storage jar. So here we see again little effort spent on the superstructure of the tomb. So this was a burial that was done rather quickly. And of course, a 6 to 7 year old, you can't get that through the jar opening, so they had to break part of the pot, place the child in it, and then cover it up with the shirts of the vessel. And you can see in the section that it was just large enough to fit this jar. Now let's see some examples from non-ceramic burial containers. Here we have some stones and boulders in a semicircle. And just below the surface we found the remains of a mud coffin containing the disturbed remains of an adult male. You can see here that the head area was undisturbed, so there was nothing lying, well, there was no indication that there was a necklace or collar given to this individual. Only the abdomen area had been rifled through, but nothing was found within the mud coffin, and just a few shirts on the surface from which it's uncertain whether they belong to this tomb or a tomb slightly higher uphill. Here another example, high up the hillside. We see a lot of stones and boulders used within superstructure, and when we removed those, within the burial space we found the remains of a female burial in her early 30s, and she was buried in a reed coffin. Now, after 4.5 millennia, hardly anything remained of the reed coffin, but enough to give us an idea what it was. And within this burial space there was something special that we noticed, in that it was filled with very fine sand that is not found on this hillside. So at the time of the funeral, after the body was placed in the reed coffin, they had to have covered the reed coffin with this fine sand before placing these heavy stones on top, because it would not have been ideal to place heavy stones directly on the reed coffin, which would have clearly done no good to the body within the coffin. So they covered it up first with the fine sand, And as this sand is not present on the hillside, they had to have brought it with them during the funeral in separate containers. So that gives us an extra clue on the number of people needed within such a funeral procession. But we'll get into that later more. So here are some drawings. We have the superstructure. The burial space was here, and when we look at the section, they leveled part of the hillside surface for reception of the reed coffin, and then of course here they poured over the fine sand before placing the stones on top. Another example, this is the other intact adult burial that we had, again 1.5 meters diameter approximately, nice stone cairn. Within the center of the boulder outline, we found the remains of an adult female in a tightly contracted position, and we had some indications of rope, so she was tightly bound together in this very small burial space. And furthermore, because this was an intact burial, we know that this woman was only given one shirt with her as burial good, and this shirt had to represent an entire vessel which sustained her in the afterlife. So it's a very poor burial compared to others which we will see later on. Here we have an indication of what is only needed for the burial of a 1.5 to 2-year-old. If it was not for the Medoum ball that had been broken in two when we found it here scattered on the surface, we would have walked by this area without paying any attention to it, but because the Medoum ball was there, we excavated the small area here in the red outline, and to our surprise we found a tiny basket. It's a diameter of just slightly more than 20 centimeters, which is all you need for the burial of 1.5 to 2-year-old. There was no objects with it, but you see just how small a space is needed for burying these small children on the hillside. And this is important, we'll outline this later on. A final example is our best equipped tomb that we found. The upper part of the tomb had been disturbed. Luckily the looters didn't go deep enough. So scattered on the surface in the picture that you see here, we found many pieces of a circular limestone offering table with fixed pedestal. This one comes from another tomb, but you can imagine something similar being buried here. And both the surface of the offering table of the one depicted here and the one buried in this tomb had scratch marks, so this object had been used in life already. And on the surface we found pieces of a variety of ceramic vessels. The beer jar here was still found in situ in a small space next to the burial location, which was found here under the surface here. And within the disturbed or poor, badly decayed remains of a wooden coffin, we found an adult female buried again in a contracted position, and lying just in line of sight east of the coffin we found 5 alabaster vessels, which had all 5 of them been broken in 2 at the time of the funeral, so that looters couldn't use them anymore, but this was still good enough in the afterlife. Mixed in between these alabaster pieces we found pieces of ochre, a variety of shells which came from the Red Sea, some alabaster beads, And here this bone, object, it's either a hairpin or a spoon, but unfortunately the tip end was damaged, so we don't know anymore what it was. And around her neck we found hundreds of faience beads from a collar, and also in the coffin a flake of copper or malachite. And only in one other instance, in one other wooden coffin burial, did we find a few flakes of this copper. So due to the rarity, it gives us an indication that these copper pieces were really seen as status objects, which were only given to a few people with them in their grave. But the variety and the number of burial goods in this tomb is it's the best that there is. The most of the rock circle tombs hardly have any burial goods, and if there are any at all, it's just one or two pots. So what we have here, with the wooden coffins at least, is they have some more burial goods, but the majority, it's really limited. So, recap again. So we have data now for over 230 burials and potential burials over this rock circle cemetery, stretching a distance of 2.7 kilometers. When we look at some of the data more specifically, when we look at the burial containers, we see that about a third of the containers used in the excavated tombs were a pottery coffin. And more than half of the tombs contained another type of ceramic container. So, looking at this combined, 3 in 4 out of the excavated tombs had a ceramic burial container. A portion had an organic container, be it a wooden coffin or a reed basket or a reed coffin. A tiny fraction had a mud coffin, and only in a few instances was it not possible to determine what kind of burial container was used. When we look at the graph at the bottom right, you can see that depending on how old you were at the time of death and your size, a variety of options in terms of burial container were possible. For children, of course, being small in size, smaller vessels were the primary choice, and none of the burial containers that were used for children were specifically made for a funerary purpose. When somebody died, they looked around, and the first best thing where their child fitted in seems to have been chosen as burial container. Number of the vats had burn marks and soot traces on the exterior, so they had been used in the habitations before finally selecting them as burial container for a child. The same is when you look at adults buried in large vats. These vats in general were also used already in life, either in the brewery or in the bakery before they ended up being used as burial container. And often we saw that these vats had been damaged, or there was a hole in the bottom or something, which rendered them useless in the village. So they recycled them as burial container. Another indication is that some of these vats were unusable in the village because they were the potter had overfired them, or they during the firing they became deformed, and rather than discarding them, They still reused these deformed and overburned vessels as burial container. So some people had stated that these ceramic containers were used as that they symbolized the womb or an egg, which were symbols of rejuvenation. But when we see that these vessels had already been used in life with their burn marks, or they were completely misshapen, then I don't think this is the case. There certainly were not symbols of rejuvenation. It was just the most practical container lying around, which was reused as a burial container. And a recap of what I said, depending on how old and your size, and then what choice of burial container was picked. You can see on the left table. But as an adult, of course, not everybody was buried in these large vats. You see that 1 in 4 chose to be buried in a pottery coffin, and a pottery coffin is something that was, of course, made on purpose for as a burial container. So some of them paid attention to their afterlife and made preparations to be buried in a proper burial container rather than in one of these reused vessels. And when you had the means, the best or the richest people within the local community chose to be buried, or their relatives had them buried in the wooden coffin. And these, as we have seen, also had other kinds of burial goods with them. Let's have a look at the where all this variety of burial containers were placed on the hillside. Here we see that pottery coffins, you find them everywhere. On the top of the escarpment, mid-level, and near the desert plain. When we look at burials in vats and jars, it's the same thing. They're all mixed together, so there is no separate zone for large vat burials or storage jar burials. The green ones are the large vats, the dark blue are the medium-sized vats, and so on. You can see where the basins and the storage jars and the decorated jars, they were all mixed together. Burials in non-ceramic containers, there are of course fewer of them. In the last season we found 3 mud coffins in this area. There are probably more in along the length of the cemetery. Reed containers we found mid and up on the upper edge of the escarpment. Some more were found in Zone 8C, but further to the north. And the wooden coffin burials, we see that they are near the base of the hillside and mid-level. But yeah, these 6 are the only 6 so far identified. When we put it all together, you see again more clearly that everything, all types of burial containers were mixed all over the hillside. Orange is a ceramic burial container from which we could no longer determine the type. So there is no separate zone for pottery coffins or vats or jars. And this map shows you clearly that adults and juvenile burial containers were also mixed together. So there was no separate zone for adults or children. Everybody ended up on the hillside. You really had to have done something bad not to be buried here in the Rock Circle Cemetery. And you can see again here on this slide, that adults, children, and juveniles the burials were mixed together. When we pay attention to the age groups, we see that about 6 out of 10 were adults, and around 4 out of 10 were juveniles and fetus burials. When we look closer at the age groups, we notice that we're missing 0 to 1-year-olds, and that teenagers are also underrepresented. When we look at this in more detail and compare this with other excavations, for example in El, which is south of Luxor, where the French IFAO conducted excavations around 20 years ago. It's a large pre-dynastic to early Old Kingdom cemetery, and there their physical anthropologists estimated that with a life expectancy of 25 to 35 years, about a third or about a quarter of the children died in their first year, and another quarter died before they reached 18. So half the population was dead before they were 18. When we look at our Dayr al-Barsha figures, we see that a quarter of our population, we don't have any data. And teenagers are also underrepresented. So we had to look for a reason why, what could be an explanation. And when we look back at this map with the distribution of adult, juvenile, and fetus burials, you notice that in most instances we found fetal remains only at the base of the escarpment, where there was more sand around the boulder superstructures, and these fetal remains were partially preserved within these sandy layers, while you saw in the pictures earlier that higher uphill the burial containers were placed on the desert surface, when then stones were placed around it, so there was hardly any sand in most cases, unless it had been brought along, where these tiny remains of fetuses or 0 to 1-year-olds could have been preserved. And we had seen this tomb where the 1.5 to 2-year-old was buried in only a basket of the size of about 20 centimeters. So a 0 to 1-year-old has an even smaller body. And if these tombs were disturbed, then in 4.5 millennia, nothing remains of the skeleton. And of course, we only examined the small part of the hillside, so you know that 0 to 1-year-old really requires practically no space to be buried. So this is an indication why we don't have any 0 to 1-year-olds anymore in our excavated sectors. It's just that their skeletal remains higher up the hillside have all been eroded away, and therefore, because we have skeletal remains of juveniles of an undetermined age, because the skeletal remains are preserved, presumably these are then individuals, teenagers, or at least in this age category. So that we can explain why, although it's difficult to determine the age of that, we only have a limited number of determinations, but how we can fill the missing gap also here. Let's go quickly over, have a look at the body treatment. Again, it's important when you're using vats and jars that the bottom of the vessel is not flat. The rounded surface has an impact on the burial position. Of course, in a pot, the body is placed in a circle. And when the body decays, everything slumps down to the center, so it's very difficult to determine any original burial position. Therefore, it's better to look at the burials on a flatter surface. And there we could see that people were buried on their left side, on their right side, or buried on their back, or even, as we had seen, upright in a seated position with a pot placed over them. In terms of orientation, there was also no standard norm. It varied from north to south, to east to west. But no one was buried anymore with head south facing west, which was the preceding norm, or the norm in the preceding period. About 1 in 8 of the people in excavated tombs, we found traces of textile. So some people at least had underwent treatment in their habitation, either being wrapped completely in cloth, or the limbs were wrapped in cloth. But we'll look into that more closely. And as said before, some of these bodies and containers are covered with fine sand, which were brought at the time of a funeral to the hillside. Because the rock circle tombs are surface burials or near surface burials, little remained preserved of organic material. We need to look at some better preserved examples found elsewhere in Egypt, and some of the best examples were excavated by the Italians in Jebelain. And on the left and middle is probably the only picture preserved of an intact burial, a pot burial, with an individual still nicely wrapped in textile. So it gives you an idea of what the rock circle tomb burials may have looked like as well. When you look at the wooden coffins, either people were wrapped in a bundle of cloth and then tied together, or individuals had their limbs wrapped individually and the body. So this may also have been the case in the rock circle cemeteries. Nearby in Nuwayrat, John Garstang excavated some early 4th Dynasty rock tombs at the beginning of the 20th century. There is a contemporary rock circle cemetery at the site, but the link between the rock tombs and the rock circle tombs is something I have no time to explain, but at least the pictures give you another idea of what the rock circle tomb burials also looked like. On the left we have a pottery coffin burial covered in cloth, and you see also here pieces of textile used to tie the body together, and a ceramic lid to cover the pottery coffin. We have examples of fragments of lids in all 4 rock circle cemeteries, so some of these vessels were closed off in such a way. Garstang also found an intact burial in a wooden coffin, and again here you can see that the limbs were wrapped individually, and pieces or cloth were used to bound the body together. Here I'm going to show a little video to give you an idea of what a funeral procession may have looked like. Let's start. So turn off the audio. Of course, here this is the tomb, the opening slide, and the first rock circle tomb that I explained, with the pottery coffin where the 19-year-old woman was buried in. That had been placed on the hillside with the stones around it. Here you see it takes 4 people to slowly move this 20, the pottery coffin weighed more than 20 kilograms. And because it's a ceramic vessel, you have to go careful. You drop it, the whole thing breaks. So imagine the reverse, where the ancient Egyptians had to carry this uphill, and carrying that by hand would have been delicate, so they would have needed support, we used a wooden plank. They probably did something else. But it also gives you an idea that 4.5 millennia ago, it's highly unlikely that they would have placed the body already in the pottery coffin, because then the weight would have been double, triple what we're carrying now, and would have made it even more problematic and difficult to carry this across the desert plain and then uphill. So you can imagine a procession of a number of people carrying the burial container, a number of people carrying the body of the deceased, perhaps some more people with vessels with this fine sand that I talked about, some people carrying burial goods, be it a few pottery vessels, perhaps some relatives, think even of a priest, but the weight and of the container and the body already gives you a clue of how this funeral procession looked like. I have no time to go into details into the pottery that we found. Suffice to say that it's a variety of open and closed vessels. They can be dated clearly from the late 2nd Dynasty to the early 4th Dynasty, so about the end of the reign of Peribsen to the end of Snofru, early Khufu, which is a period of about 140 to 150 years that our rock circle cemetery was in use. In terms of stone objects, we had limestone offering tables, some alabaster vessels, and these were mainly found in wooden coffins and rarely in pottery coffins. Beads in a variety of materials were found with women and juvenile burials. The flakes of copper or malachite were only found in 2 wooden coffins. Shells, the red seashells, were rare. Some tombs had bivalve shells, which could have been used as receptacles for cosmetics. Ochre was only found in 2 wooden coffin burials. And then, the other objects listed are even rarer. Distribution, when you compare this with the burial container distribution map, you see that only a few tombs actually had non-ceramic burial goods. So purple are the tombs with some beads. Blue pins are those with alabaster objects. Here the green are the 3 limestone offering tables that we found. So here, and another one, S78A. And the copper flakes, one was found here and the other one also in S78A. So non-ceramic objects are very rare in these rock circle cemeteries. And I'm gonna slowly round up, but we also conducted several systematic surveys. So in these 5 survey grids, which cover about 10% of the rock circle cemetery area in zone 8, we used this to have a look at the density of the cemetery and also used this to calculate the number of people buried on the hillside, and through various calculations you can estimate that there were around 1,000 burials placed on the hillside between zone 8A and zone 8C. And through some more calculations, which I don't have time to explain, you can calculate that with a life expectancy at birth of between 20, 25 to 30 years, the community responsible for this cemetery, at least on the zone 8A to 8C escarpment, would have been between 100 to 300 persons large. When you look at the map, 100 to 300 for this part, we know that there were also burials in the desert plain here and here in zone 7, so the community was even larger. But contrary to what you see today, where the village of Dayr al-Barsha is where everybody lives, and this is all agricultural land. When you look at the pottery in more detail, we noticed that the earliest pottery was not concentrated in one area, but you found that in several areas in Zone 8A and B, where the earliest tombs were. And then in the course of the 150 years, additional tombs were built along the escarpment so that the whole thing merged into one big cemetery. And then some here and there we find some of the oldest or earliest pottery where the last tombs or rock circle tombs were built. So here and there we noticed that the area was in use throughout the 150 years. But other places, for example in 8C, there were no wooden coffin burials identified there, and the range and types of pottery was also more restricted and limited than what we had here in 8B and 8A. So the people buried here, it's an indication that this part of the cemetery was used for a shorter period in time, and they also had their own burial customs, which were slightly different from what we had here. So I can't go into greater detail, but it gives us an idea that rather than having one large village from which people spread out to bury their loved ones, we seem to have a number of hamlets, smaller communities spread out over the length of the area here, and where somebody died, they moved into the specific areas of the hillside before the whole cemetery merged into one big one. And also, yeah, that you see here that 8C, the families or the small hamlet responsible for this one, they were not as successful as people living here. So you see there is a movement, an appearance, an increase in family or hamlet and a decrease and decline of others. So in the course of this 150 years, there is a non-stop movement of individuals and rise and decline of families, of which we can see the end result here in the cemetery. So I'm a bit over time, but to wrap up, we see that a rock circle tomb consists of a burial container that was placed directly on the bedrock, or at most in a very shallow pit, around and over which stones and boulders were placed to form a more or less circular stone dome or cairn. The tombs had a diameter of about 1 to 4 meters. We found in it burials of fetuses, juveniles and adults. So basically everybody got buried on the hillside. And this is one of the last times that you can see an entire population being buried in a cemetery. Later on in the 5th, 6th dynasty, you only find the elite rock tombs and the fancy shaft tombs, but where the normal people were buried, that's more difficult to relocate them. So here the rock circle cemeteries is one of the last times when you have the complete population. And they were buried in a wide variety of burial containers, as you have seen. Some of them were clearly wrapped or covered in textile, and when present, there were only a limited number of burial goods. And so, at least for this part in Middle Egypt, the rock circle tomb seems to have been the standard tomb type for the non-elite people between Dayr al-Barsha and Nuwayrat from the late 2nd to early 4th dynasty. Why they suddenly appeared, these rock circle tombs, we don't know. And why they suddenly stopped, it's also not possible to tell. We see later on in the 5th, 6th dynasty a change in burial customs, that people tend to be buried in shaft tombs with in elongated coffins where they are buried in extended positions. So in the course of the 4th dynasty, the burial customs seem to have changed, And being buried in all these variety of burial containers no longer seems to have been the popular choice, and where the common people from after that were buried in this part of Middle Egypt is no longer known. So that remains to be researched. Okay, so if you have any questions, you can always email me. I've listed a number of articles with more information on the rock circle cemeteries here in this slide and the coming slide. You can download them for free on my academia page. So here is the other part. So feel free to contact me if you have any additional questions. All right, thank you for your attention.